Much for joining the August edition of Conversations on Social Reproduction. My name is Prashant. I'm consultant lawyer at the Laws of Social Reproduction. And the topic for today's seminar is improving working and living conditions of domestic workers, reflections from research and practice in India. I welcome all the panelists for this event. Yeah, I also wanted to ask if that the recording is on, right?
Yes.
Just want okay, thank you so much. Okay, the School of Human Development at IIHS since 2018 has published 3 studies on domestic work with the support of International Labour Organization. The researchers at IIHS have joined us today, and I'm very happy to introduce and welcome them. Antara Chowdhury, Divya Ravindranath, Kinjal Sampat, Nidhi Sohane, Rashee Mehra, and if the other researchers have joined, welcome to this event. We also have joined with us Geetha Menon, Joint Secretary of Domestic Workers' Rights Union, Karnataka, and Meva Bharti, Secretary of Rajasthan Mahila Kaamgaar Union, Rajasthan. Okay, so now I will hand over the floor to the researchers for the presentation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I would like to thank Prashant. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Thank you. So, thank you, Prashant, and I'd like to thank you and Professor Koteswaran and the entire team at both King's College London and the Laws of Social Reproduction to give us this opportunity and platform, not just to present our work, but to actually, sit together and collate discrete but connected studies. We do so today with one aim in mind, which is to we draw on insights of many studies we've done over the last 4 years. So there, I'd like to suggest a bit of a correction. It's actually we're not drawing from the 3 studies as mentioned. We are drawing from many more than the 3 studies. The 3 studies mentioned were done with the ILO, and they were largely to do with the employers of the domestic workers. But in addition to that, we have other studies to which I'll come to in a minute. So today we do that with one aim in mind, which is to actually draw the insights in a specific way, that is with the frame of regulation. What does it tell us about what to do, what not to do, the flags it gives us against the opportunities that it cites towards pushing the conversation on this. The way this presentation is conceived is apart from this introduction, and we have largely two other sections. In section 2, we draw on very specific studies. Quickly going through them is the first one. So we have a study on breastfeeding and health of domestic workers. We have one on transport and mobility. We have another one that is on rental housing of domestic workers. Then we have a wage and work study, which was largely done as a part of COVID-19 impact and recovery. You see it under social protection bucket here. And then we have what Prashant had earlier mentioned as housework, employment work, and employment conditions listed here under that. Under that, we have 3 reports. It was a single study done across 2 cities in India. Now, we beautifully put across a timeline of 4 years. And the reason why we mention them and the reason why we are able to actually talk about and draw insights on regulation is I would like to underline the fact that all of these studies were a part of the process and ethos of co-production. So the study on health, housing, transport and mobility and social protection was done with the Mahila Kaamgaar Union based out of the Rajasthan Mahila Kaamgaar Union based out of Jaipur. Meva Bharti on the panel here is the founder secretary of the union of those domestic workers, and it's about a 16,000 strong active members in the city of Jaipur. And the last one that is mentioned was done with the employers. Now, when I say that it was done as a part of co-production, there each study had its own mode of coming together. So there were times when we went with questions to the union members and they kind of refined our questions, they participated in the research, there were many workshops. But there were studies, for example, the COVID impact or the housing study, where the question itself came from the union. So it was almost like getting commissioned by the union saying, well, these are the issues that we are hearing from domestic workers, and can you tell us something more systematically about actually it was the union members to and us doing research side by side on the field, and therefore the ethic of co-production has meant that our questions have been sharper, closer to the ground realities, and sometimes the entire discipline and the rigor of systematic data has also penetrated the thinking of the union, and made them look at the same things very differently over time, which both Geetha, Menon and Meva, Bharti will allude to in the final section. So coming to the final section, we move from the specific evidences that my colleagues will take us through to actually talking about pathways to regulation. Here we will, apart from the studies, we will also listen to the two union leaders about their experience with both collectivizing and advocating across all three stakeholders, right? The state, there's employers, and then there are domestic workers themselves. And they actually are working at the confluence of all three. They've already tried certain things, what has been the experience on the ground, and it's about, we are talking at least 2 decades of experience on ground of doing this. So the third section will talk about that. As we do this, our objective we have in mind is that we make explicit the specificities of this sector and the nature of the work involved in this sector, so as to we are able to reevaluate the cheat sheets to regulation that we have all come to kind of accept tacitly, and come to more conversations that can result in effective regulation that is effective on ground as much as it sounds effective on paper. So with that, I'll invite the next speaker and my colleague Antara to take us through the next part of the presentation.
There were some chats about a voice breaking. Is it better now?
I think there's a lag in the video, so maybe if you could just turn off the video, it's a Wi-Fi issue potentially.
Okay, we can do that.
Is this any better?
Yes, go ahead.
So moving on to the observations or like the insights and findings, we'll keep moving between the two. Into the specific studies, I wanted to also touch upon some of these trials. So some of you may be familiar with it, and some of you may even have a much deeper understanding than we've discussed here. But I thought it's necessary to touch upon it before, because the later discussions will constantly keep coming back to the characteristics of the work and the workers, and how that shape the conversation on regulation in domestic work slightly differently from other kinds of work. So domestic work is informal. There is no legally binding contract between the worker and the employer. Only a verbal contract that covers some aspects of the work, such as the basic list of tasks and their rates and leaves, The conversation on benefits, bonus, increments, compensation for extra work is often not the part that is covered in this verbal contract. And further, even this verbal contract, there's no protection in case any of it is violated. There are minimum wages and protection from harassment at work because of extension of some of these laws to domestic workers. But the actual implementation of minimum wages have been found to be inadequate, and there are lots of challenges, such as sometimes these rates are lower than the actual wages, and when even if it is adequate, the enforcement is an issue because the workplaces are private households, and there is no mode to go and inspect the household or these household practices. So at that in that case, it works at best like a standard practice that can be invoked while negotiation of rates, but they don't necessarily have a legal uh, sanction. The other bit is the salary here in domestic work, unlike and we're mostly talking about part-time domestic workers in all our work. The salary, unlike many other informal sectors of work, is regular and it's monthly, which has also been an incentive for many to join the sector. But then there are other aspects of wages that are precarious. So the increments are not consistent, they're not universal, and even when they are, they don't keep up with the inflation to maintain real wages. Some gains in the rate of work through um, increments can also be lost if the employers are changed. So if a worker has worked with someone from 20 years and experienced increments over these 20 years, if for some reason you had to move to a different employer, you completely lose because the years of experience do not count the same way it does for some other work. And during COVID, it was in our income and wage study for a COVID where we found that a lot of workers faced this kind of loss of years of negotiation for increments. Now, one of the biggest tensions in the sector has also been valuation of the work itself, which is undervalued, no doubt. The arguments that it is perceived as extension of feminine domesticity and not as work. Some tasks are segregated by caste and perceived as low value work. Further, when you have multiple employers and there are multiple combinations of tasks, how long they are done, how much is the quantum of the work itself and not just the type of activity, it becomes really challenging to come up with a standard wage rate for all to which will consider all of this variety. So that's why it's also under progress, the work on trying to come up with a wage rate card which can actually work out. There are also other non-wage benefits in the sector which the employers extend, but they are at the discretion of the employer. They are inconsistent because the relationship across different employer households tend to vary. And also the employer's notions of what their responsibility is also constantly varying between households. For example, the terms of dismissal have always been arbitrary. And according to a survey we did in 2020 in Jaipur with 500 workers, 90% of them had not been paid for the month of April and May, as they didn't show up to work during the nationwide lockdowns. The more than half of the employers didn't call back the previous worker in the coming months, and they used this moment as a moment to even reset wages. So while these may not be so prevalent in a usual, but they do make the worker extremely vulnerable and also work as a disciplinary mechanism, which we'll come to later. Now, moving on to characteristics of the workers. Today, a large population of part-time domestic workers are women. The other household members are also likely to be in informal and precarious employment. For example, in construction sector, in other kinds of daily wage work, or in informal restaurant and hotel sector. In Jaipur, where most of our primary studies are based in, most of them are migrants, but saying anywhere between 1 to 50 years, which makes us think what even just a single notion of a migrant really means. And the average years of residence of these workers hover around 15 in many of our surveys. And so because of this, many of them do use rental housing, and which adds a fixed cost to their household. Then they have thin documentation because of it that affects their access to general welfare schemes. So these kind of different kinds of marginalities come together and affect what they can and cannot access. And caste is, of course, another factor that mediates opportunities within the sector itself, with tasks like cooking and caring, which are valued higher in wages, reserved for upper castes, and such discrimination gets mirrored in more general cleaning tasks as well with lower wages. Now, while these workers may be regular salaried employers, we see that because of all these intersections, they are vulnerable, and thus regulatory frameworks have the potential to address this and build more resilience to invest and plan in their future. Uh, and when we look at the characteristics of the work and the workers, we also see how this sector reproduces a lot of gender and socioeconomic inequality and discriminatory practices. And thus, any intervention that happens for more decent work in the sector will also hit upon that. And we acknowledge that there's also this reason why any attempt for new forms of regulation has faced disinterest all these years and even active backlash, be it soft or harder regulations. But these characteristics are the background to which we share our insights and later speak to. So we'll go beyond some of these things and also look at employer practices and perceptions on terms of employment. So what the employer perceives the ideal working conditions to be, and what do they actually practice. We'll also look at social protection, housing, mobility, and health, and how when we study domestic worker through these dimensions, what do they tell us about the sector and also how do they inform our practices. So, so, this the first bit of insights is continues to be about the characteristics of the work itself. It's from a recent study we did with the ILO. The study was designed to measure quality of work by looking at things like income security, work security, social security, and also recruitment channels of paid domestic workers. It was done in Bangalore and Chennai with around 3,800 households, and it is available in the public on the ILO website. Now, the employer practices and perceptions and the rationale that they would share for it elicit that the employers individually and also as a group had a really overbearing discretion on setting terms of employment. Someone who works with the sector is very well aware of it, but it's just a moment to just remind us that this is exactly why a regulatory framework is so important, because even now the employer discussion on what the terms of employment are really high, even in their own rationale. So they do not even consider the other side. For example, so if you look at when we look at the recruitment pathways, the recruitment heavily relied on reference, referral, reputation, right? So from the neighbors, from the workers, and the reputation is something they built within the house, but also there was reputation within the neighborhood, right? And these reproduce conditions for discriminations, because workers who have been working in one category of work find it hard to break into another, as the way to get a job is through reference, and someone who has been hiring you for one set of work will usually not refer you for another kind of work. And these kind of discretion and the fact that it relies so much on reputation also discipline the workers, as employers can share their subjective assessment of the workers with others and affect their hiring opportunities if they negotiate too hard, or if they challenge the terms of employment that are offered to them. And even when a lot of unions and workers groups work with employees, they work in a really challenging environment, because this is also the conditions that make collective action really difficult, and also the reason why it's so necessary. Um, Even when we discuss how wages are decided, their own affordability and the neighborhood rates are a really important component of it. Now, the average median household expense on domestic workers was about 5,000 rupees per month. And the average employer household earnings overall were more than 15 times that, and even in some households, this was much, much higher than that. So then, in that way, what does this affordability mean? And I don't remember the exact paper that I read it in, but it quoted other groups of workers who had articulated very well that employers continue to see hiring workers as a right they have. And what wages they can pay or not pay is an afterthought. And it's something that must be challenged. And the other bit is about the employer's perception. So we asked them, be it about maternity leaves or illness or injury benefits or wages itself, what is it that they think is the ideal condition or terms of employment that employers should do, even if you cannot for any some reason. Now, many employers believe that they pay generously, which is more than the work should be valued at, and some even say that and some say that they pay adequately. So most of the employers reported that the payment of wages wasn't an issue. The other bit was that even in the perception, the support for illness was accepted, but the support for maternity or injury wasn't. Now, the bonus payment practices, so only 21 to 41%, and by this I mean 21% in Bangalore and 41% in Chennai. Um, did pay bonus to their workers, and even within increments, only 32 to 42% of the employers reported that they paid increments, and only 1 in 4 households of those who paid the increments said that this raise was connected with additional work, which brings us to this sense that even the employers' perceptions about what are the ideal terms of employment and practices signal that the normative is much less than the standard labor rights or what a decent work is imagined to be, which is another reason to not just bring in regulatory framework, but also think about socialization of better norms for employers in the sector. Um, the other bit is also from the same study, but a different part of it, where we thought we should look at a lot of studies on unpaid work or paid work, look at one and not the other. There is a lot of theorization that brings them both together, but we thought if what when we look at both of them together, right? So some of these are observations and some of them are more like insights. So 7 to 21% of low-income households also reported hiring a domestic worker, versus in high and medium income households, it ranged from 40 to 77%. And within housework, so I'll come to the implications together at the end of talking about all of this. And within housework, so when we look at all housework activities, whether they are paid or unpaid, food preparation as a set of activities took the most amount of time and was the largest share of the work, and it was followed by cleaning activities and childcare activities. But when we look at the hiring rates for each of these set of activities, uh, we see that mostly when people hire domestic workers, they hire for cleaning activities, and food preparation and childcare is second and third, and there is a decent 10 to 15% of difference between the two. Now, this just makes us think, right? So, what parameters can explain that as a set of activity, your food preparation is the highest share, and then there is cleaning and childcare. But when you're hiring workers, you're hiring more for cleaning and not so much for food preparation and childcare. So one of this could be what activities are seen as having more drudgery or for which you will want to hire someone. The other is a lot of other cultural factors and gender factors also come into play when you start deciding, okay, which of these household activities can we outsource and ask someone else to come in, which we can also see when actually people hire domestic workers for cleaning, the overall time that was spent in food preparation, sorry, for food preparation. When you hire a domestic worker for food preparation, unpaid hours within that activity also remain quite substantially. So it's not as if someone is coming in and taking on a large share of this work, but someone from the household has to constantly be there or manage it. And whether it's a matter of the nature of activity or whether it's a cultural expectation to do it, is something that we talk about more in the report. Um, I'll move on to the next one because we can come back to it when we discuss our implications.
No, but I think you're talking about it resulting in maybe a marginal reduction, but not replacing the work the employer, especially the woman who's employing the domestic worker, so the woman of the house. Yeah, we can go.
Okay.
So this is drawing from a study on housing conditions of domestic workers. We observed that in low-income rentals, essential services lie outside the scale of the individual dwelling unit. So we conceptualize the scale to be what we about the condition of rental housing can be explained at this level. And we recommend that this setup should be considered as a unit of recognition, enumeration, and intervention for rental housing. To give you an example of this, from our sample set of about 103 such setups, 70% had access to water taps only at the level of the setup, not at the unit. 50% of these setups had densities, had water taps bearing densities up to 25 individuals per tap, which is substantially a very high load. Similarly, for toilets too, we saw that 70% had access to toilets only at the level of the setup, not at the unit. About 30% of the setups had a load of each toilet bearing 25 individuals. While all setups had access to electricity, a staggering 80% pay higher than government set rates for every unit of electricity they consume. We see thus that there is a high cost yet poor access to utilities. So we clearly see that there are trade-offs being made on affordability as well as adequacy. And we hypothesize that this could be improved through interventions and incentives to landlords at the level of the setup. According to the Deepak Parekh Task Force on Affordable Housing, expenses on housing should not exceed 30% of monthly income of any household. We find, however, that domestic workers pay up to 10% higher than this on rent and an additional 10% of their income on utilities, combined utilities like electricity, water, sanitation costs. Further, while rent is hiked regularly, wages do not witness the same hike. Rental support and increased minimum wages are possible pathways to ensure rental housing is affordable. A critical thing over here was about the legality of rental housing and rental setups. 90% of the setups, residents had no written rental agreement. 50% of the setups, residents do not have address proofs. In India especially, address proof is a prerequisite to register into government databases and to access social security systems. So not having an address proof excludes all these citizens who can otherwise be part of these larger databases. What we propose is that beneficiary identification for social protection schemes should be separated from address proof, as most migrants do not have it and are excluded from the social protection at the outset because of this. A good thing that we saw was that Anganwadi was found to be the most accessible social infrastructure, with 80% of the setups having access to one Anganwadi within the radius of 1 kilometer. This widespread accessibility of Anganwadi should be leveraged to improve labor and housing conditions of domestic workers, who are usually mostly women.
Fresh, right?
Anganwadi is a creche. Now we draw from a pilot study on transport and mobility of domestic workers. So domestic work is undertaken in multiple spurts through the day and in multiple places of work. And therefore, domestic workers undertake numerous trips through the day in commuting from home to work and across multiple workplaces, and then back home again. Traveling this is a critical part of a domestic worker's work day. In this pilot study of about 8 domestic workers, we saw that the average distances between workplaces was less than a kilometer, while the distance between home to work tended to be more than a kilometer. And the average cumulative time of travel every day was more than an hour. An emerging inquiry from the study is about the absence of data on the time and cost of long distance travel undertaken by domestic workers. Another critical inquiry is the role of local labor markets and other networks through which domestic workers find work, which I will talk about shortly. So another finding that we saw was walking was the most common mode of transport that domestic workers chose. This was followed by cycle, bus, chartered public transport like autos, e-rickshaws, etc. And then finally motorized two-wheelers. Safety on the path and infrastructure of transport were cited by domestic workers as challenges in their everyday mobility. Now, this choice of a chartered public transport is noteworthy as it signifies a flexibility which domestic workers get by not waiting for the bus. And this is what makes them choose, this is one of the reasons which makes them pay a higher cost on transport rather than waiting for the public transport. So this also presents a challenge to improving conditions of mobility, and which means that private providers of transport should also be considered as a stakeholder when we think of mobility of domestic workers. Just one second. And it presents questions of what is shaping what. So how do women find work? How do domestic workers find work? And what are the factors that affect this choice of finding work? There is definitely a role played by networks, their existing networks with other domestic workers or people from their village or from wherever they come from. Information available. The cost and the convenience. Now I'll hand it over to my colleague again, who will talk about maternal child care.
So, in 2018, which was also one of our first interactions with the union in Jaipur, we went in with a maternal and child health study, and we sought to understand how do conditions of informal work shape maternal and child health, and by exploring how women in informal work. So earlier we looked at multiple forms of informal work, and later there was a study which was only on domestic workers, managed exclusive breastfeeding and other early childhood care. So it's looking between periods of 0 to 6 months and also 0 to 2 years, which are agreed upon in the public health literature as some of the essential pathways to child development. We observed that women were navigating the work, the optimal care, the knowledge of what optimal care is, and their work in the best ability they could within the conditions of work. By which I mean they would just if you can see. If a household, by which I mean that they would work for as long as possible into pregnancy, which is sometimes up to 8 months or even 9 months, and then return to work early because there is no maternity leave or compensation, and a lot of the income or the earnings of these women were very essential to household expenses, sometimes taking care of the fixed cost within the household because these were more regular incomes compared to what the other household members were earning, even if they were not the highest uh, earnings within the household. And they were returning any like between 4 weeks to 2 months, and the average, in fact, for more than half of them was 4 months. Now, if the household had other sources of stable income or savings they could rely on, the worker would discontinue work if the household can afford, but it was still difficult to return to work when willing in such cases because there were no childcare arrangements. So it would work the other way, right? So you can discontinue because the household can afford, but then you cannot return to work because it's not necessity. And there is no childcare arrangement that allows the woman the freedom to come back to work. So in both ways, somewhere it was a tricky environment because it wasn't essentially there were no conditions where she could personally choose how long a break from maternity she would want to take, and it was somehow determined by the work conditions and the household cultural practices.
Slide on.
Hmm? Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the nature of work within domestic work itself, and it comes out even more in our study where we looked at multiple sectors of work, where we could actually compare domestic work with home-based work, with street vending, and with other kind of vending, which is called a fairy. Uh, it, in terms of characteristics, it involves much longer duration of trips. These workplaces are much farther from the house, and they also have longer hours of vending or work uh, throughout the day, unlike domestic work. But what I mean, but when we look at domestic work specifically, right? Um, Now there are multiple environments because a worker can work in multiple households, and different households have different employer attitude towards bringing a child to work or not bring their child to work, or different attitudes towards being flexible about coming in a bit early or a bit late, depending on what your child needs in that moment. So it was always tricky to manage these multiple employer attitudes towards childcare, due to which the women will actually prefer uh, to not bring the child to work and find other kinds of alternatives within the place they live. The other reason is this: they are very short trips, right? So to carry a child constantly between households, it's really difficult. And also within domestic work, unlike what we heard from others who do vending, is that your child is not in front of you all the time because you have to constantly move around the household and be alert to other things. You cannot keep an eye throughout your work duration, even if it's 20 to 30 minutes. So that's another reason they would not. Which overall tells to say that this idea that, oh, there should be a childcare at the workplace itself does not logically work for domestic workers. So you need to have a childcare place which can sort of optimize, like where there are a lot of employers, or which sort of creates like these or maybe you need childcare centers closer to household and not workplace when it comes to
We just check for the audibility with the audience.
okay. uh,
Prashant. Prashant, can you hear us?
Yes,
Yes, I can. Yes, I can hear you.
is there static though?
No, I think it's just Geetha.
The audio is clear. To me, the audio is clear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. We were getting some feedback about the audio not being clear, so we were just checking. Sorry.
Geetha ji can call is on the phone and she'll speak on the phone, and that's how it will work.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can call her.
Okay.
So I'll quickly wrap this bit, and so there are some implications that we have about it, such as uh, increasing the entitlement of maternity benefits to compensate for the loss of average earnings, so that women can take slightly longer break even if the household conditions do not allow it. And there are several others, but some of them are actually not sector specific. So we will cover these set of our insights later in section 3.
Yeah. Rashee, we'll invite Rashee onto the to speak, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can we go to the next slide, please? Um, Thank you. So I'll be speaking on insights on employers' orientation on legal coverage and social protection and what we found, and our research shows that largely employers aren't keen, but there's not one reason for it. And That's because there are few employers that felt that there's no need for such action. They do not recognize domestic work as a sector of work. And further, they want to avoid any scrutiny and regulation, and want to avoid any wage regulation. One of the respondents to our question on social protection and laws for domestic worker, one of the respondents said that I will not allow the government into my home. So such a policy should be in the ambit of the government, and that it's not the employer responsibility. There were some who suggested that they may support, but there is distrust in intention and implementation capacity of the government. Many expressed distrust in the state's intention, that there would be implementation gaps. Further, they also said that employers will circumvent. Who will monitor so many employers? One respondent, told us, and that yes, a good benchmark would be required if such a law or such social protection policies for domestic workers were to be rolled out. For some, it did arouse sympathy from employers who acknowledged that domestic workers do need additional support to sustain themselves. Some recognized that earnings were not enough. But having said that, many sort of, reasons were given as to why they currently employers couldn't do it. And so some said that they couldn't afford, don't have the means. There are conflicting needs and intra-household decision making, again, incredibly gendered. So where women said, that this is not a decision I can take, it's a decision that my father will take or my husband will take. Many said that it could be conditional, and conditional, like, my colleagues already said, sort of on the behavior of the worker, sort of looking at, these kinds of traits in a worker. So conditional in that way. And that the state must also contribute. So it cannot just be the employer, but the state must step in as well. Long-term relationships with the worker were sort of pointed out again. People said that earlier in the day, the workers would, be a part of the family for a whole life. And that's not the case now, because both employers and the domestic workers are mobile and change locations of where they stay and where they work. And many also said that the workers may not be interested in getting into legal hassles of registration and regularization. Many were discouraged by the delivery and operational details. So there was definitely a trust deficit in the state's ability to run welfare schemes, quoting other schemes for other informal workers, many times saying that these had failed. One of the big things for people who did actually agree and said, we would be interested in sort of contributing to social protection policies or, for domestic workers, said they do not want procedural responsibility. One respondent said, if it is anything more than click of a button and I transfer some money into an account, then I will not do it. So if you expect me to go and register, it's not something that I am willing to do. And how will you link employers to domestic workers individually? So many also said that I'm not the only employee. There are 5 other employees. So how are we going to split what we are going to give? And so these procedural sort of, operational details of how a policy like this would work is something that the employers were skeptical about. They also spoke about existing non-wage support, and these varied again greatly. Some were also providing medical insurance, thinking of things like pension, but most were about, providing a meal at home, etc. And when these discussions were happening, there was, of course, a language of care versus rights. So it was couched in the language of I do care, not so much that it is the worker's right to demand and get these social protection measures. There was also, of course, the dualism of care and control. So, at one level, there was things like you should, I should offer a meal to the domestic worker when they come, and the other was that if I'm giving a leftover meal, then she must have it and she's throwing it away. And these were the kind of sort of sometimes the kind of examples that came up in our conversations. And the importance of a study like this on employer perceptions on the laws and social protection for domestic workers is that this is the kind of environment that we are looking at if we have to intervene with the employers. And this is where the unions and must push, and this is the current sort of ecosystem of what the employers believe. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rashee. And with that, I think we proceed into our section 3. But before we do that, unfortunately, we've been discussing with Geetha Menon, the union who was supposed to join us on this panel. She's on her way from a public meeting and she tried joining in through her phone, but I guess there are some internet issues and she hasn't been able to join us. However, she tried listening in and will be sending her response to the entire session to us and the organizers, and we can perhaps circulate it later. That's just one piece of announcement that I wanted to make. We deeply apologize at our end for this. But I guess it was a very important meeting which is happening, which is a public hearing actually on domestic workers. So I think that's it also reflects in how practice shapes our ways of doing things. Sometimes it's difficult. Before we move into section 3, the thing that I wanted to lay out is, and this is a section we have imagined to talk much deeply about regulation, is that if you look at the titles of the slides in the previous section, it said enmeshed character of other dimensions. Apart from what we consider as core labor issues of wage, work conditions, leave, income security, all of that, is that, and this has been one of our learnings in working closely with domestic workers and unions, is that you cannot divorce the questions of housing, safety, mobility, health, childcare, and unpaid domestic work from the issues that are considered core in terms of wage and work conditions. And therefore, our aim here was to actually introduce those other specific dimensions. One of the dimensions we don't talk about at all, but has we know that exists, is the issue of violence and safety. It isn't an issue we have studied systematically. It's not where our expertise at the IIHS lies, but there are other organizations that have done that, and any kind of move towards regulation should take that issue very, very seriously. But just a kind of a suggestion for the next piece before I call Meva Bharti in, is that we think of also regulation and with it all the infrastructure that is needed for that regulation to be effective. So what does it mean? What is the kind of bureaucratic line of hierarchy we need? What is the kind of answerability and accountability do we need? What is the kind of outlay do we need? What are the kind of institutions and quasi legal support that we need as we begin to imagine regulating? And thirdly, a connected point is that we look at regulation across different kinds of approaches. To kick off the conversation, I have put down three kind of approaches that exist. So there need to be like a limiting and a penalizing sort of bucket, which sort of for all the malpractices that happens. But beyond that, there is actually a need for standardizing and setting normative practices that have to do with a lot of support, medical care, that can lead to a much better outcome, much better work conditions. So let's not just think in terms of limiting and penalizing, but also building it to actually, standardizing. And thirdly, I would say mobility for the practitioners of this profession within the sector and outside of the sector. And right now, any kind of in terms of imagination, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of institutions, none of these pieces are actually there. We don't even have a welfare board. So a kind of we're starting off on a plain paper in that regard, but the unions have worked far too long and have a lot of learning from advocating for the sector. So therefore, it would be nice to actually bring Meva Bharti in at this point to talk about her experience of advocacy and what she thinks are the particular lack in getting this done. Even if we were to get a policy passed, I mean, how is it going to sit in what kind of regulatory spaces and implementation spaces? So Meva Bharti, please, I'd like to invite you to bring in your comments here.
Just wanted to say quickly that Meva ji will be speaking in Hindi and I'll be translating in the chat box in English.
सभी को गुड इवनिंग। तो मैं अपनी बात हिंदी में रखूंगी। ये किंजल जी आप या कोई भी साथी उसको वो करेंगे ट्रांसलेट। हेलो
जी हम ना चैट पे साइमल्टेनियसली इसको ट्रांसलेट कर देंगे, तो आप थोड़ा बस धीरे बोलेंगे तो हेल्प होगा।
हाँ, थोड़ा सा धीरे बोलेगा। राशि और अंतरा वही नीचे चैट पे इंग्लिश में आपके सेंटेंसेस लिख रहे हैं, तो साथ साथ हो जाएगा। जी आप शुरू कर सकते हैं।
ठीक है, तो मुझे जो बात रखनी है किंजल जी वो कानून के राउंडिंग रखनी है या
हाँ, तो कानून के रंग तो रखनी है, लेकिन इसमें जो हमारा एक्सपीरियंस रहा है, हमारा जो अनुभव रहा है ग्राउंड पे कि हमारा पॉलिटिशियन के साथ क्या अनुभव रहा है, ब्यूरोक्रेसी के साथ क्या अनुभव रहा है, लेबर डिपार्टमेंट, हाउसिंग डिपार्टमेंट, और तैयारी कितनी है कलेक्टिव ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस की और कलेक्टिव यूनियंस की अपने आप के बीच में कितनी नेटवर्किंग है, कितनी तैयारी है एक इफेक्टिव कानून जिसे बोल सके, जो लागू हो सके वैसा कानून लाने की। तो इन चीजों पे थोड़ा आपका टिप्पणी चाहिए।
ठीक है, तो मैं अपनी बात शुरू करती हूँ कि हम लोग बिल्कुल एकदम ग्राउंड में जाकर के काम करते हैं और ग्राउंड से जो पूरा एक निकल के आया है रिसर्च के माध्यम से वो रखा गया है। हमारे पूर्व साथियों ने काफ़ी अच्छे से उन पॉइंटों को रखा है। तो हमारा जो अनुभव रहा है, मैं सबसे पहले शुरू करूँगी कि जो RWA हैं उनसे मैं शुरू करूँगी कि वहाँ पे हमारा क्या अनुभव रहा। जब वर्कर्स की कोई भी समस्याएं आती हैं तो बड़े बड़े जो अपार्टमेंट हैं और अभी ज़्यादातर सिटी में स्मार्ट सिटी के नाम पे काफ़ी अच्छे से बन रहे हैं, तो उनके अंदर हमारा एक बड़ा अनुभव था कि 500 वर्कर्स वहाँ काम करती हैं और काफ़ी बड़ी एक रेजिडेंसी है। वहाँ पे सबसे बड़ी समस्या महिलाओं को आती है कि वो खाना कहाँ बैठ के खाएं। वहाँ पे उनको कोई अलाउ नहीं है, वो अपना खाना लेके आती हैं, 2 पारियों में वो काम करती हैं, तो वो कहाँ जाएंगी। वहाँ उनको बैठने नहीं दिया जाता है और बोला ये जाता है कि आप यूनिटी करेंगे हमारे खिलाफ और हमारे बारे में आप बातें बोलेंगे, फिर कल आप रेट बढ़ाने की बात करेंगी, कल आप छुट्टी मांगने की बात करेंगे, कल आपके हमारे घर में कोई भी दिक्कत होगी तो उन सुविधाओं की आप लोग सब बात करेंगे, इसलिए उनको वहाँ पे बैठने नहीं दिया जाता है। उसको लेकर के हम लोगों ने काफ़ी अच्छे से एक पहल की और बात शुरू की और हमने वहाँ पे बात करने के लिए स्पेस बनाने की कोशिश की, तो हमको स्पेस उसमें मिला नहीं और हम लोग हमारी ही एक लीडर के माध्यम से वहाँ पे घुसे, तो हम सिर्फ 2 चीज़ें वहाँ पे करा पाए। एक तो हमने टॉयलेट की व्यवस्था वहाँ पे कराई कि आप एक बाथरूम की व्यवस्था इनके लिए करिए, जिससे महिलाएं जब पीरियड्स के दौरान आती हैं तो उनको नहीं पता है कि घर से आई हैं तब उनको रास्ते में पीरियड आएंगे या वो पूरे दिन काम कर रही हैं तो वो कहाँ जाएंगी, और आप सैनिटरी पैड रखिए। तो उन्होंने सिर्फ 2 चीज़ें ही मानी है अभी। एक तो सैनिटरी पैड उन्होंने रखना शुरू किया, अलग से टॉयलेट की व्यवस्था की, और अभी हमारी लड़ाई उनके साथ चल रही है कि वो खाने के लिए जो महिलाएं बैठती हैं तो उनको यूनिटी में नहीं बैठने देते हैं। ये एक मैं अनुभव बता रही हूँ। दूसरा, बहुत सारी समस्याएं कार्यस्थल के ऊपर जो इस स्टडी में भी आया है, और काफ़ी अनपेड वर्क भी कराया जाता है, ये सब चीज़ें हैं। ये हमें एम्प्लॉयर की साइड से जब हम देखते हैं चीज़ों को तो हमें बहुत सारी चीज़ें ये भी दिखती हैं कि उनको समझ आ रहा है कि ये सब चीज़ें जो हम कर रहे हैं ये ठीक नहीं है, पर वो उनको बिल्कुल एकदम साइड करके और वो चीज़ें लेके जाते हैं। और जब बात की जाती है कि मैं इसके लिए क्या होना चाहिए, कानून बनना चाहिए कि नहीं बनना चाहिए, इनकी मिनिमम सोशल सिक्योरिटी होनी चाहिए कि नहीं होनी चाहिए, तो उसके ऊपर हाँ ज़रूर करते हैं, पर जैसे ही उनको ये लगता है कि ये हमारे ऊपर आएगा तो फिर नहीं होते, और वो कि हमारा घर ठीक है, हम अच्छे से कर रहे हैं, ये सब चीज़ें हैं। जब इन्हीं को लेकर के हम लोगों ने इलाके में पार्षद होता है तो बहुत सारी महिलाओं को, वो काफी सालों से रह रही है, उसको पेंशन की जरूरत है, वो उसकी पात्र भी है, डॉक्यूमेंट भी कंप्लीट हैं उसके, तो सिर्फ बहुत बार ये बोल करके कि ये बाहर की महिला है और ये माइग्रेंट है, कल यहाँ नहीं रहेगी या जो भी इसका है, और वो चेहरा देख करके या भाषा को देख करके ये सब उनके साथ पूरा भेदभाव और ये सब होता है। तो जब हम लोग बात करते हैं तो वो करें आप कौन से कानून की बात कर रही हो और ये क्यों होना चाहिए इनके लिए, कोई काम ही नहीं है इनका। ठीक है, वो आ रही है मेरे घर में 1 घंटा काम करती है, किसी के 2 घंटे करती है, तो वो इस टाइप का एक व्यू हमारे जो जनप्रतिनिधि हैं उनकी साइड से हमको मिलता है। फिर हम इससे आगे बढ़ करके जब हम लेबर डिपार्टमेंट में कि जो भी वर्कर है उसका सबसे पहला राइट है कि वो लेबर डिपार्टमेंट में जाके बात करे, कोई समस्या वेतन की बात है या उसको और कोई दिक्कत हुई है तो वो वहां पे जाएगा। वो रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी लेने के लिए तैयार नहीं है और न वो रजिस्टर्ड करने के लिए तैयार हैं उनको कि हम कहाँ पे रजिस्टर करें और ये कौन से कानून के दायरे में आते हैं कि हम इनको रजिस्टर्ड करें। ये सब बातें वहाँ पे होती हैं और फिर लास्ट में ये होता है कि ये हमारा इश्यू ही नहीं है, ये तो पूरा पॉलिसी लेवल पे जाके बात होगी, हमको जो आदेश देंगे वो हम कर देंगे। ये स्टेप यहाँ पे खत्म हो जाता है। उसके बाद हम जाते हैं कि अब श्रम मंत्री है वो तो कुछ करेगा और वो इसको लेकर के उनको चिंताएं भी होनी चाहिए। तो हमारा 2 बार का अनुभव है और मैं तो अब क्या बताऊं कि बहुत ही वाहियात अनुभव रहा। हम गए लेबर श्रम मंत्री के यहाँ पे और वहां जाकर के हमने बात की, तो वो हम जिस मुद्दे को लेके गए हैं, जो हमारा डिमांड चार्टर है उसको लेके गए हैं, उस पर बात करने की बजाय हम 7 एक प्रतिनिधि मंडल था तो हमारे अलग अलग इंटरव्यू कर रहे हैं कि आप नेता हो क्या, गाड़ी में बैठा के लाए हो क्या, आपका पति क्या करता है, उसका घर है कि नहीं है, सबके अपने घर हैं, सभी काम करती है कि नहीं करती हैं, मतलब इस तरह का एक पर्सनली पूरा और चीजें लेना और एक बहुत ही लाइट वे में रखना और ये ठीक है हम देख लेंगे, ये तो काफी सालों से चल रहा है और हम देखेंगे कि हम क्या करेंगे, क्या देखते हैं, इस टाइप का कोई संतुष्टिपूर्ण उस टाइप का जवाब नहीं होता है। उसके बाद में जब अलग अलग पूरा ये सेक्टर में जब काम हो रहा है अनऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर में, तो वो ये मानते हैं कि इनको ये अनऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर के अंदर ही हम डालेंगे। तो अभी लेटेस्ट हमारा मुख्यमंत्री को हम लोगों ने एक ज्ञापन दिया और उसमें हमने बात की और एक प्रतिनिधिमंडल जाकर के मिला। उसमें ये हुआ कि मुख्यमंत्री ने पूरे जो सोशल सिक्योरिटी से संबंधित डिपार्टमेंट, लेबर डिपार्टमेंट, फूड वाले, इनको सबको बुला करके एक मीटिंग बुलाई और उस मीटिंग के अंदर हम लोग थे। तो उस मीटिंग में जब हम लोगों ने सुझाव रखे कि आप कम से कम इतना तो कर सकते हैं कि आप इनको रजिस्टर्ड करिए वर्कर को, और आप रजिस्टर करके इनको एक आइडेंटिटी मिलेगी और उस आइडेंटिटी से ही इनका आगे की सब चीजें काफी आसानी से होंगी। उसको ये होगा कि मैं एक वर्कर हूँ और मैं ये काम करती हूँ। तो उनका पहला ही सवाल ये था कि हम कौन से कानून में करें और हम इनको करते हैं तो ठीक है कि हम ऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर में हम डालते हैं। 2008 का एक कानून है जो सभी मजदूरों के लिए सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट लेके आई थी और वो उसमें पूरा चला भी था कि हम करेंगे। कहा कि चलिए आपकी बात मान लेते हैं, हम कर देते हैं, हम फंड कहाँ से लेकर के आएंगे इसके लिए, इसको चलाएंगे कैसे, तो उसके ऊपर भी हम लोगों ने काफी सुझाव दिए। और बाकी के ऑर्गेनाइजेशन के लोग भी उदयपुर से थे, कोटा से थे, जोधपुर से थे, बीकानेर से थे, इन सब साथियों ने डोमेस्टिक वर्कर पे पहली बार एक अच्छी मीटिंग हुई और उसमें सबने सुझाव दिया कि आप त्रिपक्षीय बोर्ड बनाइए और बोर्ड में आप 3 जगह से आप हिस्सा ले सकते हैं। एक आप वर्कर को रजिस्टर्ड करें, वहाँ न्यूनतम आप लीजिए, जो एम्प्लॉयर उसको हायर कर रहा है आप उसको रजिस्टर्ड करिए, उससे फीस लीजिए, तीसरा आप स्टेट अपना वेलफेयर का फंड उसमें डाले। तो ये
मेवा दी, ये वाला आप प्लीज फिर से बोलेंगे थोड़ा सा कि जो स्टेट वाइड मीटिंग हुई थी उसमें क्या क्या हुआ। मैं थोड़ी धीरे टाइप कर रही हूँ तो मैं बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है डालना चाहती थी। जो स्टेट वाइड मीटिंग हुई थी आपने कहा बीकानेर सब से लोग हैं।
ये अभी हमारी लेटेस्ट 19 तारीख को हुई है और 19 जुलाई को। तो उसमें ये था कि पहली बार डोमेस्टिक वर्कर का एक नेटवर्क दिखा राजस्थान में, और थोड़ी हम लोगों ने मेहनत की उसके लिए। तो उदयपुर का एक ग्रुप था, कोटा का एक ग्रुप था, बीकानेर से एक ग्रुप था, जोधपुर का एक था, और जयपुर से हम लोग थे। तो ये सबने मिल करके हम लोगों ने वन डे एक धरना लगाया, और उस दिन पूरे दिन इसी मुद्दे के ऊपर पूरी चर्चा हुई। पूरा डोमेस्टिक वर्कर को वो दिन पूरा दिया गया। उसके बाद ये था कि हमारा डिमांड ये थी कि ये जो डिमांड चार्टर है ये हम मुख्यमंत्री से डायरेक्ट मिलना चाहते हैं। तो मुख्यमंत्री का स्वास्थ्य भी ठीक नहीं था और उनके पैर में फ्रैक्चर था। उन्होंने कहा कि मैं एक मीटिंग बुला देता हूँ और आप वहां जाकर के ये दीजिए। तो हम लोगों ने सब ऑर्गेनाइजेशनों से 2-2 लोगों को चुना गया, और वहां पे हम लोग गए तो पूरी मीटिंग बुला रखी थी। और मीटिंग में उन्होंने कहा कि आप अपनी बात रखना शुरू करिए। तो हम लोगों ने अपना डिमांड चार्टर, कि ये हमारा एक संयुक्त डिमांड चार्टर है और हम लोग ये इसके ऊपर अपनी बात रख रहे हैं। तो जैसे ही हमने बात रखना शुरू किया, उन्होंने पहला ही सवाल किया कि हम क्यों रजिस्टर्ड करें इनको, और हमको क्या बेनिफिट होगा इसके लिए। ये पहला उनका सवाल था। तो हमने उनको फिर उसके ऊपर भी अपने सुझाव बताए कि आपको क्यों रजिस्टर्ड करना है। फिर दूसरा सवाल उन्होंने किया कि हम किस एक्ट में इनको रजिस्टर्ड करें। तो हमने 2008 के कानून का उनको हवाला दिया कि पहली बात तो आप एक बोर्ड बनाइए सेपरेट, आप उसमें इनको रजिस्टर्ड कर सकते हैं। यदि वो नहीं कर सकते हैं तो आप 2008 का जो कानून है जो पूरे असंगठित क्षेत्र पे लागू हो रहा है उसमें आप रजिस्टर्ड करिए, और सेपरेट एक बोर्ड बना दीजिए। और वो बोर्ड 3 पक्षीय होगा, उसमें एम्प्लॉयर होगा, वर्कर होगा और सरकारी प्रतिनिधि होंगे, और उसमें तीनों ही जगह से आप फंड लीजिए इनसे और आप चला सकते हैं। तो उसमें जो ब्यूरोक्रेसी के लोग थे उन्होंने कहा कि हम लोग उसको एम्प्लॉयर को क्यों रजिस्टर्ड करें, और हम क्यों उसको इस दायरे में लेकर के आए, वो तो बाहर रहेगा और वो तो उसके अंदर नहीं आ सकता है। ये इसको लेकर के काफी बहस हुई, सब लोगों ने अपनी बातें रखी, और उन्होंने कहा कि आप जब एम्प्लॉयर को बाहर रख रहे हैं तो फिर वर्कर की तो कोई डेफिनेशन ही नहीं है। ये कोई यहाँ पे तो हमारी सहमति बिल्कुल नहीं हो सकती है, और आप उसको साइड कैसे कर सकते हैं। तो फिर काफी बहस हुई, लड़ाई जैसा माहौल हुआ वहां पे, और ये सब चीजें हुई, वो बोलने ही नहीं दे रहे थे। तो बीच में ही निखिल जी ने थोड़ा जाकर के इंटरफेयर किया, और उन्होंने कहा कि आप अब बात तो रखने दीजिए लोगों को, जो आप आए हैं बोल रहे हैं तो आप बात सुनने का कम से कम इतना धैर्य तो रखिए। तो उन्होंने फिर वापस सुनना शुरू किया। लास्ट में उन्होंने कहा कि आप लोग क्या चाहते हैं कि हमारे घर में आप पुलिस लेके आएंगे, हमारे घर तो प्राइवेट घर है, आप उसको कानूनी दायरे में लेना चाहते हैं, आप लोगों का ये पूरा उद्देश्य है। इस तरीके से वो पूरा बहुत ही अलग तरीके से बात रख रहे थे। तो हम इतनी सालों से जब लगे थे करते करते, तो हम देख रहे थे अलग अलग तरीके से अलग अलग व्यू आते थे अधिकारियों के, और उस दिन वो एक सामूहिक उनका आया कि सभी लोग बैठे थे, और उनका साफ दिख रहा था कि हमको ये जो सेक्टर है डोमेस्टिक वर्कर का, इसके लिए इसको जरूरत नहीं है कि हम लोग इनको कानूनी दायरे में ला करके और हमारे घरों में हम पुलिस घुसाएं। तो ये एक हमारा अनुभव है पूरा ब्यूरोक्रेसी के साथ, जनप्रतिनिधियों के साथ, सरकार के साथ। और एक दूसरा ये है कि कहीं न कहीं मुझे एक चीज और भी लगती है कि एक ठोस तरीके से जो नेटवर्क होना चाहिए डोमेस्टिक वर्कर का, और एक तरीके से पूरा उठना चाहिए, कलेक्टिव बात होनी चाहिए, और एक कलेक्टिव जो एफर्ट्स लगने चाहिए, वो कहीं न कहीं काफी कमजोर है। और वो स्टेट के ऊपर भी है, और हम जब नेशनली पूरा देखेंगे तो वहाँ भी वो काफी कमजोर हमको दिखता है। कि आज तक कभी भी बहुत सारे ग्रुप हैं, बहुत सारे प्लेटफॉर्म हैं और बहुत सारे अलायंस हैं, वो कभी भी जॉइंटली ही एक लेकर के पार्लियामेंट में अभी तक एक ड्राफ्ट नहीं गया है। 3-4 ग्रुप हैं जो अलग अलग ड्राफ्ट देते हैं, बात सेम होती है, जाता अलग अलग है। तो ये एक मैं सजेशन की बतौर बता रही हूँ कि मुझे तो ये एक सख्त जरूरत लगती है कि नेशनली एक प्लेटफॉर्म बने, और जो प्लेटफॉर्म बने हुए हैं वो कम से कम वर्कर्स के इस मुद्दे पे तो एक आए और जॉइंटली उसको उठाएं, और दमदार तरीके से यदि हम रखेंगे उन चीजों को और कलेक्टिव रखेंगे तो काफी अच्छे से मुझे लगता है कि वो मुद्दा पहुंच पाएगा और उसके ऊपर फिर पार्लियामेंट में बहस कोई एक चाहे वो सोशल सिक्योरिटी के फोरम में आए, चाहे वो कानूनी के दायरे में आए, कैसे भी आए तो वो एक कहीं न कहीं हमको दिखेगा। और नहीं तो फिर वही है कि अलग अलग चीजें अभी चल रही हैं और बहुत सारी समस्याएं हैं, वो हर बार वही चीजें होती हैं कि ये समस्या चल रही है, वर्कर्स के साथ ये दिक्कत है, तो वो उनका समाधान कहीं होगा नहीं। और अकेले अकेले चलने से भी वो समाधान मुझे नहीं दिख रहा है कि वो शायद होगा। तो ये एक पूरा एक प्रीपेक्स है और बहुत है समस्याएं हैं। अभी रोजगार का बहुत अभाव है, जब मर्जी हो वैसे निकाल देंगे। आप पेमेंट की बढ़ाने की बात करेंगे तो आप पे पुलिस का केस लगा देंगे। तो बहुत सारी चीजें हैं वो। और घर के अंदर जो काम कर रही है वहाँ सुरक्षा का एक बड़ा सवाल है कि उस घर के अंदर हमारे सामने हमने बहुत महिलाओं को देखा है कि उनका घर के अंदर ही किसी न किसी वजह से एक्सीडेंट हुआ है काम करने के दौरान, जब वो अपने काम के ऊपर है और वहां पे दुर्घटना होती है, फैन से गिर जाती है या पैर फिसल गया, घुटना टूट गया, रीढ़ की हड्डी टूट गई सीढ़ियों से फिसल के उसी घर के अंदर काम के दौरान, तो कोई कुछ वो नहीं है। उल्टा ये होता है कि यदि दबाव है पीछे से यूनियन, यदि पीछे से यूनियन का दबाव है तो थोड़ा बहुत उसको इलाज करा देंगे और कम से कम 1 महीने की उसको सैलरी दे देंगे यदि दबाव है तो। यदि उसकी कोई पहचान नहीं है, वो महिला को कुछ पता नहीं है, तो कुछ भी नहीं होगा। उस टाइम वो कर्जे में जाती है पूरा, उसके काम जो भी काम है वो पूरे चले जाते हैं, प्लस उसका इलाज है वो कर्जा है उसके, और खाने की कोई व्यवस्था होगी नहीं। और उल्टा ये होता है कि ज्यादातर रेंट पे रहती है तो वो मकान खाली करने की नौबत भी आ जाती है। तो इस तरह की ये स्थितियां हैं और इसके ऊपर ये भी है कि इस तरह की केस स्टडियां की जा सकती हैं कि उनको लगता है कि नहीं ऐसा होता नहीं है घरों के अंदर, तो हम वो भी करके और ये एक पावरफुल तरीके से बता भी सकते हैं कि ये हुआ है और वो लोग हैं हमारे बीच में। तो ये इस तरह का है पूरा मिला करके।
हाँ, तो सो मेवा दी मैं 1 मिनट लूंगी और जल्दी से, हालांकि राशि ने बहुत अच्छे से चैट में ट्रांसलेट किया है, पर कुछ कुछ बातें हैं जो मैं दोनों हिंदी और इंग्लिश में दोहराऊंगी फिलहाल, ताकि मैं आपको और दिव्या को इनवाइट कर सकूं इसके दूसरे भाग को डिस्कस करने के लिए. So I was just telling Meva Bharti that while the chat has done a good job, Rashi's done a good job of translating real time in the chat. I'll quickly summarize some of these absences and also invite my colleague Divya and Mevaji to discuss shortly little small questions that I have for them. So one of the, I think, apart from all the details that Mevadi told us about, working, she spoke about RWA's labor department. RWAs are resident welfare associations. These are extremely powerful in most metropolitan cities and in India, and they tend to regulate domestic workers in ways that are very, very penalizing. And in a way, the increasing importance of the Resident Welfare Association mirrors the fact that collectivizing of the domestic workers is leaves much to wanting. So while you have residents collectivized as resident welfare associations and are able to get through whatever they want, because of the lack of collectivizing at the end of domestic workers, we don't have a way to challenge them. The second point is that I want to make is that the Labor Department has been extremely dismissive, and that is because I think Antara already said about thin documentation and migrant workers. So in a way, because the political establishment is not answerable, there is also a unanswerability from the bureaucracy, and also that line of accountability is not made. I think the details of the meetings with the Chief Minister of Rajasthan were well translated, so I won't go there. But I want to quickly bring both Divya and Meva in terms of. So there was a huge All India Domestic Workers Survey carried out by the government a couple of years ago, and the results of which were never published. So one is there are no estimates, and they range from 500,000 to about 5 million women being employed in this sector. And there is a complete, absolute absence of data in knowing A, the size of the sector, B, the mean wages of the sector, what are some of the fundamental information that is required to move towards any kind of regulation. So what do they have to think about that? Second, what has been other kinds of absences, like the behavior of the police and the largely the way it is portrayed in the media. If needed, we could discuss that. But one of the things that Mevadi talked about and which it gets highlighted is that this tension of trying to regulate something that is called a home, and a household is actually the most pervasive and enabling institution, but it's also the one that houses our worst kept secrets. So constantly this feedback
Hello.
that we want to get police into
Uh,
our
so,
homes has been the
sorry to
feedback.
sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say that can you please try to wrap up, because we also wish to take few questions from our audience. So yeah, we already, yeah.
Yeah, so just a quick kind of 5 minutes more, 5 minute और है. पहले दिव्या and then मेवा जी की जो next दो slides हैं, Divya, you can take on from here. And Divya, you will also take us through the Q&A session.
Yeah, I'm going to be quick in the interest of time, and also I know that there are questions. So I'll lead us towards those questions, keeping in mind the audience and the need to sort of look at, this regulatory framework and what do all these studies collectively tell us about, the domestic workers sector in particular. The reason we presented from multiple studies was to also say that it isn't enough to just think about domestic work and paid work and unpaid work, but also collectively understand the circumstances within which this work occurs, the conditions of work, and what does it mean in terms of wages and various other practices within the household where this work takes place. So one of the big questions for us really through this entire report, when we were writing it, was to understand Kinjal, can you go to the slide before, please? Was to understand what actually are the norms and values around domestic work and workers both. And basically understanding this major gap on alternative grievance and dispute resolution, where employers and employees are constantly talking about this, the concern around harassment. As Meva Didi already pointed out, there is a lot of workplace violence, and without any kind of redressal mechanism, where do workers actually go if there is a problem at their end? RWAs are sort of run by employers, so that really isn't a place where they can go. The second thing is to talk about these rate cards. For very long in many parts of the country, unions have been using rate cards to think about how employers could actually stick to a particular wage in that neighborhood. But as our study has shown, employers also have their own rate cards, and very often they're very scared to go away from that rate card because they feel they would face backlash from within their own community. Similarly, the question of welfare boards also. The construction sector, for instance, has, the BOCW, the welfare board. Do we want something similar for domestic work, and what kind of repercussions can that have? Will it actually lead to better sort of forms of delivery, social protection, and so on? Because it can be linked to various other social protection mechanisms around, domestic work. But the question really is, does it actually increase the vulnerability, because the non-wage support that employers currently give might then get reduced? But it can be deeply useful for vulnerable domestic workers who are, either elderly or have had to drop out of the labor force, or vulnerable because they're migrants and so on. I'll wrap up with the last slide, and I'll be really quick. Can you go to the next slide, please? Also to think about what this, what the studying this sector looks like. This was a very large study that we did for the ILO, but technically data on the sector is very, very limited. There aren't any registrations that happen except for the recently started, e-shram. We don't know much about either the time that is spent in domestic work. What does it mean in terms of wages? Do we do an all India survey where we sort of capture both domestic work and domestic workers as well? And how do we sort of think about these practices of discrimination that occur at homes, which are beyond social protection, and in that sense have go into some kind of a legal framework, not necessarily just one on social protection. And also looking at non-sector related concerns, right? Like how do you think about maternity and early childhood related shocks of expenses, absenteeism because mothers are caring for their children, illnesses, and is social protection the only way to sort of address this? Is this something within the employer-employee relationship that we can look at? Right now, we've understood that a lot of employers do believe in supporting their domestic workers, even if it's varied and so on. But it is coming from a space of benevolence, not that of entitlement. And how does that shift start occurring for us, especially because entitlement is sort of the only way to systematize it across households and across all employers. Otherwise, the variation is very large, and not all domestic workers are able to benefit from it. I'm going to stop there, and I think from here we could also start taking questions, between Mevadi and me to start with, and then we could pull in the rest of the team. Rasham, how do you want us to do this? Should we?
Yes. You can go ahead and take the Q&A session by yourself. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question. I guess Anita Kapoor has her hand raised. If you want to give us the question, or if you had a comment.
हेलो
हेलो
सभी साथियों को जिंदाबाद। थोड़ा मेरा वॉइस कुछ प्रॉब्लम है तो आपको ऐसे ही सुनना पड़ेगा। बोलना मला है पर मैं बोलना चाह रही हूँ। इसमें जितनी भी बातें आपने कही, पहले तो बहुत कुछ अंग्रेजी में था क्योंकि ये मेरे मुद्दे से जुड़ा हुआ था, तो मैं समझने की कोशिश कर पाई और समझी। जितना भी साथियों ने या मेरा जी ने जो भी बात रखी है उसमें मैं बिल्कुल इससे मतलब सहमति है कि सिर्फ जयपुर में ही ऐसी स्थिति नहीं है। पूरे देश भर में डोमेस्टिक वर्कर अपने आप में ऐसी वर्कर हैं जिसकी कोई पहचान नहीं है, जिसके काम की कोई पहचान नहीं है, जबकि वो सालों साल अपनी कंट्रीब्यूशन, अपनी मेहनत समाज में दे रही हैं। आज जो भी कोई कमा पा रहा है, चाहे वो 10,000 से लेके 50,000 रुपए तक हो, वो ये घरेलू कामगार की बदौलत ही कमा पा रहा है। बट फिर भी उनका जीवन बहुत तकलीफ में है, चाहे हम उनकी हेल्थ की बात करें, चाहे हम उनके घर की बात करें, चाहे उनके परिवार की बात करें। ये बिल्कुल सारी बातें जितनी भी स्टडी में आई, मैं खुद उसको देख रही हूँ और झेल रही हूँ। पर इसके साथ साथ थोड़ा मैं ये कहूँगी, शायद मैं समझ पाई या नहीं, या मेरे समझने में गलती ना हुई हो, कि हम लोगों के साथ जो काम करने वाली महिलाएं हैं उसमें बहुत सारी संख्या ऐसी है जो लिविंग वर्कर हैं, जो 24 घंटे उन कोठी में रह करके काम करती हैं। शायद ये स्टडी क्या उस तरफ भी थी, थोड़ा मुझे ये जानना है। या अब मुझे जहाँ तक लगा कि ये उनके लिए उनके ऊपर हमने नहीं फोकस करके किया है, पर मैं ये बताना चाह रही थी कि उनकी स्थिति भी कहीं पर भी एक बॉन्डेड लेबर, एक बंधुआ मजदूर से कम नहीं है। और उनके साथ आए दिन अगर हम रोज अखबार या टीवी में भी देखें तो कोई एक ना एक हादसा हमें मिल ही जाता है, एक घरेलू कामगार का सुसाइड करने का या उसको प्रताड़ित करने का, उसके साथ वायलेंस का। तो ये जो लिविंग वर्कर है उनकी स्थिति भी बहुत ज्यादा खराब है। उनको बिल्कुल बाहर तक घर के लिए जाने नहीं दिया जाता, इसलिए मैं उनको बंधुआ मजदूर के जैसे कह रही हूँ। और उनसे 16 या 12-12 घंटे काम कराया जाता है, जिसका कोई, हम अनपेड वर्कर की अगर बात करते हैं तो उनको तो बिल्कुल भी मतलब पैसा दिया ही नहीं जाता। सिर्फ उनको कहा जाता है कि आपको घर की साफ सफाई करती हैं, उसके अलावा उनको बच्चों की देखभाल भी कराई जाती है, मालिश कराई जाती है। कई ऐसे काम हैं जो कराए जाते हैं पर उनको पैसा नहीं दिया जाता। और जो उनका पैसा है, उनका वेज है जो पूरे मेहनत का, वो भी महीने के अंत में उनके हाथ में नहीं दिया जाता। जो एक प्लेसमेंट एजेंसी वाले हैं वो आकर के लेके जाते हैं, और उसी कारण वो 1 साल बाद तक 2 साल तक भी वो मजबूरन उस कोठी में उनको काम करना पड़ता है, क्योंकि जाने के कोई रास्ते, कोई ऑप्शन उन लोगों के पास नहीं होती, क्योंकि वो पैसा ही नहीं है उनके हाथ में। और वो गांव से आई तो वापस शहर, अपने गांव शहर से
जी
अकेले
जी
नहीं
अनीता जी,
इस तरह की
आपका सवाल पहुंच चुका है हम तक।
नहीं,
हमारे पैनलिस्ट जवाब देंगे। जी जी, शुक्रिया।
नहीं, जी, थैंक यू।
So Anita is also asking about full-time domestic workers who stay and work in the house of the employer.
जी, थैंक यू, आपने मुझे बहुत नहीं दिया, धन्यवाद।
Anita, okay, I'll respond to that. Anita ji is also talking about full-time domestic workers who live in the house of the employers. Our study particularly focused on part-time workers or households that employed part-time workers. And one of the most important reasons, actually through our interactions with the unions, we've also heard many a times about, the domestic workers sector has been studied adequately. There have been so many studies on the workers, and this question that came from the union on, when are you actually going to study the employers? Can we invert the gaze and actually understand the various practices that occur within the employer's home? So this entire study was focused on employers. While we have several other studies on workers, and of course they play a very important role for us to understand the sector. But what we are presenting here in terms of trying to understand the practice of discrimination are also coming from the point of view of the employer. Prashant, I don't see any other hands up, or if there are questions, I may have missed them.
If anyone have question, they can raise their hand or just unmute themselves and directly ask the question.
Okay, I can see ask me if you want to go in.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. So I had a question regarding the issues that come with collectivization. So मेवा भारती जी, आपने जैसे बोला कि संगठित करने से क्या क्या फायदे होते हैं, और जैसे ये वेलफेयर बोर्ड्स जो खड़े कर सकते हैं उनसे क्या मतलब जो औरतें कोठी में जाके काम करती हैं और उनको वहाँ पे चोट पहुँचती है, उनके लिए वेलफेयर बोर्ड क्या कर सकता है, ये सब जैसे मैं दिल्ली में काम करती हूँ तो वहाँ पे भी मैंने देखा है। लेकिन एक बड़ी समस्या आती है माइग्रेशन को लेके। तो जैसे जो औरतें गांव से आती हैं काम करने कोठियों में, उनको अपना रेट ज़्यादातर कम करना पड़ता है ताकि उनको काम मिल सके, क्योंकि बहुत सारी औरतें कोठियों में जाके काम करती हैं और इतना उनका इतने सारी औरतें होती हैं जो घर कोठियों में जाके काम करती हैं कि वहाँ पे कंपटीशन बहुत हो जाता है, और उसकी वजह से वो ना वेज सेट कर सकती हैं, क्योंकि अगर वेज सेट किया तो जो औरतें गांव से आ रही हैं उनको काम नहीं मिलेगा। तो ये संगठित होने की वजह से कुछ औरतें का शोषण होना और उनको कम काम मिलने के चांसेस भी बढ़ जाते हैं। तो ऐसे में आप कैसे संगठित करते हैं, ये मुझे जानना है।
हाँ, ये इसमें आपने बहुत ही बढ़िया सवाल किया है कि संगठित होने से आप जो बोल रहे हो कि दूसरी लोगों का शोषण बढ़ जाता है, वो शोषण नहीं बढ़ता है, वो कम होता है, क्योंकि जो आ रही है उसको नहीं पता है कि उसको वहाँ पे क्या रेट है। और मैं ये मानती हूँ कि हम भी झेलते हैं कि उसको काम की सख्त जरूरत है। तो यदि जो संगठित ग्रुप वहाँ पे है और उन्हीं के माध्यम से ज्यादातर महिलाएं उसके आसपास में या काम खोजती है, उनको पता है कि यहाँ पे इस काम की ये रेट है, तो वो उसी रेट से काम पे जाएगी और वो रेट लेगी। वहाँ पे एक इश्यू आता है कि ये तो अभी नहीं आई है, इसको काम नहीं आता है, वो एक इश्यू आता है, वो हम भी फेस करते हैं। तो उसका यही है कि वो काम की भी कैटेगरियां होती हैं, वहाँ पे बहुत सारी कैटेगरी के काम होते हैं घरों के अंदर, और वो जैसे जैसे वो महिला उस संगठन या जो भी सीबीओ जो भी बनाते हैं उसके साथ वो जुड़ती है, उसकी मीटिंग में आती है, बात सुनती है, वो ही महिला उस घर में जाके बात करती है कि मुझे अभी तो इस इलाके में ये रेट चल रही है और आप इस एरिया की ये रेट दे रहे हैं। तो वो डेफिनेटली फर्क पड़ता है, और वो शुरुआत में नहीं पड़ेगा, शुरुआत में दिक्कत होगी, उस टाइम धैर्य रखने की जरूरत होती है। प्लस जो हम लोग बात कर रहे हैं कि उनके फायदे की बात है, और वो जब आई है काम करने, तो कोई भी चाहेगा कि मुझे ज्यादा वेतन मिले, मैं जितना टाइम दे रही हूँ उसके अकॉर्डिंग। तो हमारा तरीका तो बिल्कुल यही होता है कि हम जो नई वर्कर आ रही है उसमें हमारी जो एरिया लीडर है वो पहचान रखती हैं, और ज्यादातर को पता होता है कि इस इलाके में इतनी महिलाएं अभी न्यू आ गई, और उनसे वो बात करती हैं, बात करके उनको समझाती हैं, और फिर वो बदलाव धीरे धीरे आता है।
Ankita, you can go ahead and ask question.
I think we can read out Ankita's question also, Prashant, from the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, this is about how there are issues of not having access to the creche and canteen, and like it sounds to be like a scientific institute where also the bags of the housekeeping staff is checked before they leave campus, and if these places can be held accountable.
Yeah, so I mean, that is a very common practice across the country, not just in institutions, but also in residential areas. And especially, we've also talked about sort of the RWAs, the Resident Welfare Associations, and the kind of role that they play in sort of imposing all kinds of restrictions on the worker, from not allowing them to use toilets to not allowing them to even sit and have a meal together. So yes, I mean, Ankita, all your observations actually hold true from our experience. In terms of how can they be held accountable, that is the purpose with which we started this study, to understand sort of the set of practices and also the language that the employers use when they think about both domestic work and workers. And our study sort of shows to this the fact that social cultural discrimination is very rooted within the language of how employers think about domestic work. It is gendered and it's thought of as very casual work, things that women anyways do at home, so it's just an extension of that kind of gendered work. But two, also it's very rooted in caste, where somebody else is coming to clean your house, and hence wages are low. It's undervalued as a task that's actually done for pay. So these cases are absolutely true, and there isn't any legal regulation around it. And while a lot of employers in our sample said that they would be willing to support social protection of some form, there was sort of almost unanimous opinion that there should be no law or regulation, or the government should not come into the house of the employer. So that continues to remain a huge cause of concern. While we can maybe slowly push the social protection ahead, we are not quite sure if law and regulation will ever be supported by employers in that sense.
So
I
also,
also, sorry,
can I?
I also think that part of it is one is what are you trying to penalize, and we tend to focus a lot more on events and issues that seem jarring, but that are absolutely outside the purview of any behavior acceptable. But there is definitely a lacuna of standard practices of the everyday kind, and that unstandardization of the sector is also as much a concern. So, both to the audience and to the panel, the entire effort here was to actually introduce issues of mobility, housing, etc., that often don't get discussed as much. So, while we talk about regulatory practices that penalize behaviors that just shouldn't be allowed, let's also, for a minute, take a step back and look at the lacuna that exists within the standardization of everyday practices of how do you employ people. So that's one little point I wanted to make as we proceed with this discussion.
Yeah, so also, are there any studies done or included, uh, which include these housekeeping staffs across the different sectors? And because and also comes the topic of unionization, because most of them aren't even aware that they have the power to unionize, or whether the place where they are working, they will be allowed to unionize them. Hello.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right in that sense. Like the unionization efforts are there in several cities. We have Geetha ji and Meva Didi who are part of this conversation. But the concern that you're raising is absolutely right. I mean, it isn't in that sense as widespread as we would like it to be across all cities. But to also know that the unionization has really actually move the needle in several places. Like small battles in terms of how many holidays can the workers take in a month. What happens when there's somebody sick, in terms of collectivizing when there's a case of domestic violence or employer violence. So the union is quite central to the way we understand the sector and the needs that we are putting out there to the government. But you are right. It isn't as much as we would like it to be, and it's not sort of constant across the country in that sense. Yeah.
But I think one more to Ankita's question is that there are two ways. One is the nature of the task, and one is your employer. And I think here we need to I want to point out that in one case, the employer is a household, and in another, it is actually a registered firm. While issues may remain the same, it is important to recognize also this difference of because these become definitional differences of whom we call domestic workers. Is it people who do the tasks of cleaning and housekeeping, or is it people employed in actually by households in households? So just a little bit of a caution there that I wanted to say out loud.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we are now at the end of the session. Prabha, would you like to add something?
Yeah, no, nothing. Just a very quick question about, there seems to be, after the labor codes have been drafted and passed, there seems to be some understanding within the domestic workers movement that, it might make sense to lobby for sector-specific legislation at the state level. And I'm just curious about what you think about the prospects for that. And ideally speaking, in light of the kind of very exciting research you've been doing, what would that be a venue through which to feed your research, or would you think of some other form of law for domestic workers?
Divya, would you want to take that or actually get Mevadi on this? Prabha, would
Yeah,
that be more relevant?
yeah, it's a tough one actually. I think Mevati might be best placed to answer this.
You translate the question for
मेवादी ये पूछ रहे हैं कि क्या हमें
ले ले होगी ले ले ला अंगड़ी ले ले ला
मेवादी द क्वेश्चन ये था कि लेबर कोड्स के अंदर हमें काम करना चाहिए कि आपको लगता है अलग रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशंस और लॉ होना चाहिए वर्कर्स के लिए, डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स के लिए, या आपके जो लेबर कोड्स है उसके अंदर ही हम कुछ ढूंढ सकते हैं इस सेक्टर के लिए?
ये इसमें अभी जो न्यू लेबर कोड जो आ रहे हैं उसमें के अंदर तो इनको डिफाइंड ही नहीं किया गया डोमेस्टिक वर्कर को, तो हम कैसे उसके अंदर भी लेंगे, तो कहाँ कैसे देखेंगे, क्या देखेंगे, ये सब चीजें हैं। तो वो तो मैं ये है कि अभी तक तो जो हमारा जो चल रहा है सबका ज्यादातर का यही है कि अलग ही एक आप लॉ बनाइए, जैसे आपने BOCW बोर्ड का बनाया है, और ये पूरा सेक्टर अलग है, इनकी समस्याएं अलग तरह की हैं, और उसकी डेफिनेशन में तो अभी आता भी नहीं है, जितना मैंने लेबर कोड के बारे में जानकारी मेरे को है।
नहीं, मेवादी और प्रभा जी का पूरा क्वेश्चन ये था कि क्योंकि ये नहीं है तो बहुत सारी यूनियन का मानना है कि स्टेट लेवल पे अलग से सेक्टर स्पेसिफिक लॉ बनाया जाए और एक नेशनल लॉ की बात थोड़ी पीछे कर दे और हर एक स्टेट में मुहिम चले, लेकिन जैसे राज्य के स्तर पे नेशनल स्तर पे नहीं, तो उस पे आपका कुछ जो राय बन रहा है फिलहाल का माहौल देखते हुए?
वो हाँ, यहाँ भी वही बात चल रही है कि स्टेट लेवल पे स्टेट उसको कर सकता है, यदि स्टेट चाहे तो वो बना सकता है, अलग से एक लॉ बना सकता है, बोर्ड भी बना सकता है। यदि वो बोर्ड भी बना देता है तो भी काफी फर्क पड़ेगा। और जो 24 आवर्स वर्कर्स की जो बात उठ रही थी, वहां तक पहुंच नहीं है। आप जाके उनका सर्वे भी नहीं कर सकते हो, उनसे बात भी नहीं कर सकते हो, आपको गेट पे भी नहीं जाने देंगे, तो वो भी उस दायरे में आएगा। और ज्यादातर लोग चिंताएं यही है कि हम पार्ट टाइम तक तो पहुंच पाते हैं, कैसे भी करके कोई समस्या है या कोई दिक्कत है उसकी बात आ जाती है सामने, और उनकी बातें नहीं आती है, और ये उसके ऊपर लागू होगा। तो ये डेफिनेटली ही हम लोग भी चाह रहे हैं कि स्टेट लेवल पे ये बने। यदि सेंट्रल पे भी नहीं बन रहा तो स्टेट जिम्मेदारी ले सकता है।
Okay then. I would like to, first of all, the presentation was really fantastic, and I really want to thank the presenters and researchers at IIHS. मुझे बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया अदा करना है मेवा जी का, जिन्होंने बहुत अच्छी तरह से इस प्रेजेंटेशन में उनकी बात रखी, और बहुत महत्वपूर्ण मुद्दों पे उन्होंने अपना खुल के राय रखी है, जो कि बहुत हमारे लिए लाभदायक है। I really want to thank all the researchers at IIHS, and finally our audiences who took out their time in Friday evening to join our event today. Thank you all. Yeah, thank you. Now we will end this session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
sir.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.